Hey, what is up guys? It is me, Flavio, here back with another Mafia City video. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I compare stats. About a year ago, I made a video about troop formation. Although a lot of the things that I spoke about in that video aren't mentioned in the game, it was easy to figure them out through experimentation. However, when it comes to stats, it's almost impossible to study them because of the RNG involved in the game. In the tournament, you could attack a player multiple times keeping your stats and formation the same, and you'll get a unique report every single time. This makes it very difficult to study the impact of altering stats because it is difficult to find out how much of the report has changed due to the RNG and how much due to changing stats. So instead of experimenting, I thought I'd create a simplified model of stats that usually works for most games. There are a lot of factors that haven't been considered in this model though, like the RNG of the game, the frequency of biker charge attacks, and other troop skills. So it's definitely not going to be 100% accurate, but it should still help you compare stats. While almost everyone knows that 5% damage is more important than 5% attack, it gets a bit complicated when the numbers are different, like comparing 50% attack versus 10% damage. This method should help you answer these more complicated questions. So without further ado, let's get started. There are some games that have only two attributes, attack and health. Attack is usually a number that represents the amount of damage a unit inflicts on the enemy per attack, and health is the number of hit points a unit has. Every time an enemy is attacked, your enemy's health will be reduced by your unit's attack value. There are other games that have three attributes, attack, health, and defense or armor. Defense is an attribute that weakens the enemy's attacks. For instance, if your enemy has an attack of 10 and you have a defense of 2, then you'll only take 10 over 2, that is 5 damage per attack. Or if you have a defense of 5, then you'll only take 10 over 5, that is 2 damage per attack. So we can say that damage dealt equals your attack over the enemy defense. Damage dealt is the value that will be subtracted from your enemy's health every attack. In this game, there's another stat called damage, which isn't found in a lot of other games. However, I think it is the exact opposite of defense. Instead of weakening your attacks, it's something that boosts your attacks. So for instance, if you have an attack of let's say 10 and a damage of 2, then your damage dealt will be 10 times 2, that is 20. So we can finally conclude that damage dealt equals your attack times your damage over the enemy defense. And obviously, this damage dealt value will be subtracted from your enemy's health every attack. Now let's take an example of a battle between two equal units using these stats. Unit A has an attack of 1, defense of 1, damage of 1, and HP of 1000, and so does Unit B. We also assume that both units attack each other at the same time so that none of them have an advantage of getting the first attack. If we plug in the attack, defense, and damage values to our equation, we find that each unit does 1 damage per attack, which means that it'll take 1000 attacks each for both units to kill each other. Now let's take a look at 4 different examples to see what happens when we increase each of these 4 stats by 10% for Unit A. In these examples, we'll assume that Unit B has infinite health so that we get to know the exact amount of extra damage Unit A inflicts before dying. When we increase 10% attack, Unit A's attacks do 1.1 damage, and since A gets to do a total of 1000 attacks before death, it will inflict a total of 1100 damage on B. So we can say that a 10% increase in attack also causes a 10% increase in damage. When we increase its defense by 10%, Unit A will take around 0.909 damage per attack, which means that it'll be able to sustain a total of 1100 attacks before dying. This also means that Unit A will get to do 1100 attacks and thus inflict a total of 1100 damage again. So a 10% increase in defense will also cause a 10% increase in damage. If we consider a 10% increase in damage, we'll find that Unit A's attacks again do 1.1 damage instead of 1, and thus Unit A inflicts a total damage of 1100. And finally, if we consider a 10% increase in health, Unit A's health will increase to 1100, which means that it'll now be able to sustain and do a total of 1100 attacks, causing 1100 damage. Since boosting each of the 4 stats by 10% led to a 10% increase in damage, this suggests that it doesn't matter which stat you boost, the results will always be the same. However, most of you probably know that this just isn't true. Clearly, damage is the most important stat in the game, followed by health, defense, and then attack. So why isn't this reflected in our example? And the answer to that is because this example does not reflect the stats that players actually have in the game. In our example, we assume that units A and B started with 0% buffs, that is only their basic attack, defense, health, and damage. However, we all know that almost nobody in the game has 0% stats. So let's take another example with stats that look a lot more realistic. Let's assume both units A and B now have plus 900% attack. This increases their attack from 1 to 10. They have plus 400% defense, which increases their defense from 1 to 5. They have plus 100% damage, which increases their damage from 1 to 2. And plus 200% health, which increases their health from 1000 to 3000. This means both units will do 4 damage per attack, so it'll take 750 attacks before both units kill each other. Now let's take a look at the impact of a 10% increase in each of Unit A's 4 base stats. Again, we'll be assuming that Unit B has infinite HP to see how much more damage Unit A can inflict on B before dying. If we increase the attack by 10%, Unit A's attack buff will go up from 900% to 910%, which means that Unit A's new attack will be 10.1. This means that it'll inflict 4.04 damage for 750 attacks, or 3030 damage in total. So we can conclude that a 10% increase in attack only led to a 1% increase in damage. If we increase defense by 10%, Unit A's defense buff will go up from 400% to 410%, which means that Unit A's new defense will be 5.1. This will reduce Unit B's damage per attack from 4 to around 3.92. This means that Unit B will now be able to sustain 765 attacks instead of 750. And the 15 extra attacks will increase Unit A's damage from 3000 to 3060. So we can conclude that a 10% increase in defense led to a 2% increase in damage. If we increase damage by 10%, Unit A's damage buff will go up from 200% to 210%, which means that Unit A's new damage will be 2.1. This should allow Unit A to inflict 4.2 damage for 750 attacks, or 3150 damage in total. So a 10% damage increase led to a 5% increase in total damage dealt. And finally, if we increase health by 10%, Unit A's health buff will go up from 300% to 310%, which means that Unit A's new health will be 3100. This means that Unit A will now be able to sustain 775 attacks while doing 4 damage per attack instead of 750 attacks. The extra 25 attacks will allow Unit A to deal an extra 100 damage, or 3100 damage in total. This means that a 10% increase in health led to a 3.33% increase in total damage dealt. From this, we can conclude that damage is the most important stat, followed by health, defense, and attack. So why did the second example give a different result than the first? The answer to that is simple. It's because of the huge stat imbalance in the game. A 10% increase to 1000% attack, that is the base 100% plus 900% buff, is equivalent to a 1% increase in your existing attack. In the same way, a 10% increase to 200% damage, that is the base 100% plus 100% buff, is just a 5% increase to your existing damage. So it all boils down to comparing stats relative to your existing stats instead of comparing them in isolation. For instance, if you want to compare 50% biker attack with 10% biker damage, you should consider your existing biker attack and damage while doing so. Let's say you have plus 700% biker attack and plus 50% biker damage. Before comparing the percentages, you should always add the base 100% to all your stats. So your actual biker attack would be 800% and your actual biker damage would be 150%. 50 is only 6.25% of 800, so selecting 50% biker attack would only increase your existing damage by around 6.25%. However, 10 is around 6.67% of 150, so increasing your damage by 10% would increase your existing damage by around 6.67%. So based on your stats, you'd want to select the 10% damage over 50% attack. However, if you had, let's say, plus 200% biker attack and plus 25% biker damage, the 50% attack would increase your existing damage by around 16.67%, and the 10% damage would increase your existing damage only by 8%. In this case, the 50% attack would be way better than the 10% damage. While comparing stats, you should also give preference to bulker and biker stats over vehicle and shooter stats. For instance, I choose 1% biker attack over 10% vehicle attack regardless of my existing stats because I almost never use vehicles and shooters in my formations. However, for the Vigilante Arena, you should treat bulker and biker stats at par with vehicle and shooter stats. Apart from attack, defense, health, and damage, there's another stat called received damage. This is a stat that only applies to bulkers and shooters right now. This is a negative stat that does not negate any positive stat. What I mean by that is all the other negative stats in the game negate another positive stat. For example, the enemy damage reduction stat negates the damage stat. The enemy attack reduction stat negates the attack stat. There are similar stats for health and defense. However, this damage received reduction stat does not negate any positive stats. It directly reduces the amount of damage your troops take. So in our previous equation, if damage dealt equals your attack times your damage over enemy defense, then damage received would be damage dealt times 1 minus the damage received reduction. So for instance, if your damage dealt is 100 and your damage reduction is minus 25%, then your troops will only take 75 damage instead of 100. Since this is a negative stat, it is a little different from the 4 stats we talked about earlier. As you may have noticed, the higher your stats are, the less effective increasing them will be. A 10% increase for someone with plus 100% stats is an effective 5% increase. However, the same 10% increase for someone with plus 900% stats is only like a 1% increase for them. However, when it comes to this negative damage reduction stat, it works the other way around. Let's say your damage reduction is at 20% and you increase it to minus 30%. Before the increase, you would be taking 80% of the damage inflicted by your opponent. However, after the increase, you take only 70% of the damage inflicted. This means you take 12.5% less damage just by increasing the stat by 10%. Now, if your damage reduction is at 80% and you manage to increase it to 90%, this would mean that you'll now take only 10% of damage inflicted instead of 20%. This is a 50% reduction in damage even though the stat was increased only by 10%. If you manage to get the stat to minus 100%, it would mean that your troops do not take any damage at all. However, right now that is not possible. The highest I've seen is around 70 to 77%. Before I end this video, I'd like to remind you again that this isn't how the game exactly works. It is a simplified model that I created to explain the concept of stats based on other games. There are a lot of things that haven't been considered in this model, so it's definitely not going to be 100% accurate. So next time you want to compare Vigilante active skills, Roadsters, or Godfather equipment, make sure you consider your existing stats while doing so, as what works for others may not necessarily work for you. So that's all I have for you guys in this video. I hope you guys found this video helpful. Thanks for watching the video, guys, and I will see y'all in the next one.